Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible.
Metro, it is good to be with you tonight. As Kylan mentioned, my name is Brandon, and I'm the Associate Director here at Metro. And you know, this last week, it was actually my 1-year mark here at Houston's First and in this role. And thank you, a few fans out there, thanks. What that means is in the last year, I've shared this room with you 43 times. I actually calculated, I did the math when I was sermon prepping. 43 times I've shared this room with you on Tuesday nights. And of those 43 nights where I've sat in those seats and worshiped alongside you, there's one thing that I feel like the Lord has revealed to me more than anything else. And that one thing is this, that this room, because of the people that are filling it right now, this room is full of massive potential. So what is potential? I don't know what you learned. I know what I learned. Mr. Collins' 8th grade science class, right? Mr. Collins taught me potential is stored energy. It's energy that's waiting to be used. And so picture like a bow pulled back with an arrow waiting to be released, or a bonfire that's been built up waiting to be lit. And here's what we know about that bonfire, right? No matter how wide it's been built or no matter how tall it is, it will make zero difference if a match is not first lit and laid upon it. And so why do I tell you that? I say that because faith is that match for the Christian, right? Like faith is the spark which grants us access to all of the potential that the Lord has called us into in our walk with Christ. And it's through faith and only through faith that this very room could be leveraged like that bonfire as a light for a city that desperately needs it, right? And so tonight, and why I'm so excited to continue this series, Iconic, is for that very purpose, that over the last 5 weeks as we've been in this series, we've been talking about people throughout the Bible that have been marked by deep relationship with the Lord and great impact in their lives. And though they all have different stories, right, they're marked by one thing, and it's that they had extreme faith. Though they were flawed, though they were imperfect, they leveraged their lives for God-sized purposes because they believed in his promises. And tonight is going to be no different. Tonight we're going to be talking about Moses, right? Moses is someone who's familiar to most of us. Like, he is not only one of the most influential characters in biblical history, but also world history, right? Like Moses is such a big deal. They made a whole movie about him. One of the best soundtracks of all time, The Prince of Egypt. You know it's true, yeah. The Prince of Egypt was made all about the life of Moses. Pastor Greg talked on him a few weeks ago, where Moses was in the very presence of God as he was visiting with him in the burning bush. Moses was the one who rescued the nation of Israel out of Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, and led those people into the promised land. But tonight, we're going to be talking about Moses before he did any of that. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Moses in his young adult years, when Moses is in the very same seats as you. We're going to be talking about the life of Moses up to the age of 40. And what we're going to see as we look at the young adult years of Moses is this, and I want you to catch this, that before God led Moses to conquer any of those great feats in his life, he led Moses to conquer some great fears. And the same thing is true for us, I believe. I think that all of the things which the Lord wants to call this room into, to call that you individually into, is great, but it's going to require you to face some great fears as well. Right? If faith is that match, then fear is the fire extinguisher. And so if you have your Bibles, tonight we're going to continue in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews is just a couple chapters from the end of the Bible. We're going to be in a couple books from the end of the Bible. We're going to be in verses 24 to 27 tonight. And while you flip there, let me just lay out for you what's so crazy about talking about the fearlessness of Moses tonight. it's this, that Moses was anything but fearless. Like, if you were to read the first few chapters of Exodus, where his life is laid out in more detail, you'd read that even in just the first couple chapters of Exodus, Moses is gripped with the feeling of fear twice. And yet, as we look at kind of the snapshot, the overview of his life in Hebrews 11, he's defined as being fearless or unafraid. And so how can somebody who feels full of fear at the same time be described as fearless? That's a great question, right? And it's in this, it's that fear, just like faith, fear is not defined by a mentality, but it's defined by a reality. We've been talking for the last several weeks about how faith is something visible, right? Faith is something you can see with your eyes. It's action-oriented. And fear is the same way, right? Like, fear is not defined by a feeling, but actually your response to that feeling. And it's in your overcoming or your conquering of fears that you actually demonstrate faith. And so as we look in Hebrews 11 tonight, we're going to see Moses conquer 3 fears. And he's going to give us 3 keys that we can take away in order to conquer those fears in our own lives. And so, picking up in verse 24, it says this: by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. And so this passage, it starts with a pretty simple statement, right? When Moses grew up, which begs us to ask the question, well, what happened before this, right? Like, if we've learned anything from Marvel, besides the inner workings of the multiverse, right, we've learned that every great hero needs an origin story. And so in just a couple sentences, I'm going to give you Moses' origin story. It starts with this: Moses, he was born to a Levite woman in Egypt. The problem with that was that at the time, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, he had an order out that newborn Hebrew boys must be killed. And so in order to save their child, Moses' parents wrapped him in a basket and set him on a river. And the irony of this situation is that it's Pharaoh's daughter that draws Moses out of the river, adopts him into the Egyptian royal family, and claims him as her son. Right, but the plot twist happens here in chapter 11, verse 24. It says, when Moses grew up, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And with Moses' decision, he's saying a lot more than just, hey, Pharaoh, I'm not going to call you granddaddy anymore. I'm sorry. He's saying that he's rejecting the line, the Egyptian line and family in which he's been raised, and he's actually adopting himself into a new family, the Israelites. And as he's turning his back on the people of Egypt, he's accepting the people of Israel by which he belonged. See, Moses realized that where he was not where he belonged. And the first fear that we see Moses overcome is Moses overcomes the fear of not fitting in. The first key that he gives us is that we conquer our fear of not fitting in by knowing where we belong. I know it's only May, but one of my favorite Christmas movies of all time is Elf, right? Like, I'm always thinking about Christmas, love Christmas movies. One of my favorites is Elf. You put Will Ferrell and Christmas together, you can't lose, right? I know a lot of us in here, we've seen the movie Elf, but if you haven't, the whole premise of the movie is that there's a character named Buddy. And Buddy was born to believe he's an elf. He was raised in the North Pole, right? Like, he's born and does the elf school as a child, treat every day like Christmas. The other two rules, he rides the elf bicycle, he does the elf jobs, but the only problem is that Buddy, he's not an elf, right? Like, he's 3 feet taller than everybody else. He's terrible at all the elf jobs. He's super uncoordinated. And like, I think at one point he lights a tree on fire trying to make cookies or something, right? He's not cut out to be an elf. But he doesn't realize that that's not where he belongs until that famous line, right? If he hasn't figured out he's not an elf by now, I don't think he ever will. It's in that moment that Buddy realizes that he was not made to fit in at the North Pole. And while it sounds ridiculous and crazy to try to picture like a 6'5" man trying to fit in the North Pole, the reality is, and listen to this, the reality is that you will always fight to fit in where you're at until you know where you belong. You'll always try to fight to fit in where you're at until you know where you belong. And while it's funny, it's comical to watch Buddy try to fit in with these elves, it's really sad to watch the church try to fit in with the world. Like, let's be real, there's some of you that you're so afraid of not fitting in that you've become like an expert chameleon. Like, you're here tonight, you're fitting in with the church crowd, right? Everybody around you is saying, that guy, that girl, they're the model Christian. They're living their lives sold out for God. And then come Wednesday morning, and your coworkers don't know the difference between you or Joe or Sally sitting next to you, right? Like, your values, your actions, your words, they're dictated completely by who you're with. There's some of you that you're afraid of not fitting in because you felt the pain of rejection. Like, even when I say the word rejection, your mind goes to a place where you have all kinds of baggage. Like, you're carrying a whole suitcase of hurt and baggage associated to that word. And while, like, somebody hurt you, somebody turned their back on you that you cared about, and the hurt's real, right? Like, I'm not here to discredit that. Like, it's real, and maybe that parent, that father who left, or that boyfriend, girlfriend who you thought you were going to marry turned their back on you, like, that hurt is real, but because it's so deep, you would do anything not to feel that way again. Like, you would compromise your morals, you would do anything just to be accepted by that family member, that friend, that boyfriend or girlfriend. And if that's you, let me just read one more time what Moses says, or what it says. It says, Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God. So rather than fearing not fitting in or being rejected, Moses was the one who rejected the status of belonging that was offered to him. Right? Like he had full capacity to belong with the people of Egypt, but rather he chose the people of Israel. And the people of Israel, they had no place in the world he was living in. They were outcast, they were rejected, they were harassed, right? But Moses was able to make the trade from belonging in Egypt to being an outcast in Israel because he knew where he belonged. What Moses teaches us is that we should be a lot more or a lot less concerned with whether the world will reject us and a lot more concerned with whether we will reject this world as our home. Like Hebrews 11, just a few verses up, it would describe the heroes of our faith as those who acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth, and those who desired a better country, that is a heavenly one. In 1 Peter chapter 2, it would describe all believers as sojourners and exiles on this earth, yet in the sight of God, a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and a people for God's own possession. So we are a people that have a home. It's just not here. Right? And the sooner that we realize that our home, that where we belong is in heaven, the sooner we can rid ourselves of the fear of just trying to fit in here. Right? If we continue in verse 25 and 26, I just read this, but we find here also the second fear that Moses conquers in our next key takeaway. It says this in 25, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So Moses conquered the fear of missing out, and our second key takeaway is that we conquer our fear of missing out by knowing what we value. This fear that Moses overcomes, right? The fear of missing out. FOMO, we know it in here, right? FOMO. We're all susceptible to this. Like Old Faithful Wikipedia, my go-to source for definitions. It says that FOMO is the feeling of apprehension that one is either not in the know or missing out on information, events, experiences, or life decisions that could make one's life better. So FOMO, it's that pit in your stomach that you get when you decide to stay home and all your friends are going and hanging out, and then, it's time to be real. And you're laying at home in bed watching Netflix while all your feed is your friends hanging out together. You regret, you wonder if you made the right choice by staying home, or it's why some of you're going to buy the iPhone 14 this fall, even though you just bought the 13 6 months ago. Because the 14, it's got a better camera, right? That's what they said. You don't want to miss out on what's new. To be simply put, FOMO is the fear that there's something better out there that you're missing out on. But Moses, when he's staring in the face of all that he can miss out on by rejecting the people of Israel and rejecting the people of Egypt and accepting Israel, he's able to act in faith regardless. As the son of Moses, or as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, Moses is actually an heir apparent to Pharaoh himself. And so when you think about all that he could consume and all that he could accumulate, the world was at his fingertips. And yet Moses, in faith, he decides that those things, the fear of missing out, was not going to control his life. And there's two things in specific that we see Moses reject the fear of missing out on. First is the pleasures of sin. The second is the treasures of life. So first, the pleasures of sin. Like, believe it or not, FOMO and sin, they go hand in hand. What do I mean? The decision to sin, it's almost always birthed out of this belief that you're missing out on something by submitting yourself to God's design. Like, you're operating under the belief that there is so much out there that you're actually not able to access, that there's a better life that you're not able to live in because of your decision to obey Christ. We see this from the very first sin. It's in Genesis, Adam and Eve, when they choose to eat of the fruit. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, this is the very moment when humanity fell to sin. And it says this: "So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate." So why does Eve take the fruit? It looked good, and it was desirable. Like, Eve knew all that God had commanded her, and yet there was that voice in her head that said, you're missing out on something good. Actually, you're missing out on something better than what God has for you by not eating of the fruit. And so they did. There's some of you in here, you're wondering why you keep going back to that same sin over and over again that you've told yourself that you would never go back to. Why you keep looking at that thing that you know is killing you on the inside. Why you keep logging back into that app that you've deleted so many times. Why you keep just saying, just one more drink, just one more drink. Pretty soon you can't see straight. The reason why you keep going back to those things, just honestly, it's because you believe that the fleeting pleasure of sin that those things offer you is better than the abundance of joy that's found in the person and principles of Christ. Like, you know your options, you just think this is better. You think that you're missing out on too much by not living the fullest that this world has to offer. And in doing so, you're selling your soul. You've either bought the lie that sin is much better than it is, or that God is really much worse than he actually is. And there's a guy named Augustine, and he lived in the 300s. His adult years, they were marked with preaching and teaching. He was a well-known bishop, but in his early years, his life was marked with vanity, with sexual sin, and with total and complete godlessness. he was filling his life with all of the things that he thought were going to fulfill him, and yet he still felt so empty. It wasn't until Augustine surrendered his life to Christ that he realized that those things that he once held so closely to were actually fickle and led to nowhere. He wrote this in his journal. He said, "How sweet all at once it was for me to be rid of those fruitless joys which I had once feared to lose. You drove them from me, you who are the true sovereign joy. You drove them from me and took their place, you who are sweeter than all pleasure. O Lord, my God, my light, my wealth, and my salvation." So if you're stuck tonight in the fear of missing out on those fruitless joys, let me just tell you, you are missing out, but it's on the abundance of life that God has to offer you. There's so much more, and I promise you that the thing that you are turning your back on is so much better, can provide so much more fulfillment than the things which you're just trying to fill your life with. But not only does Moses conquer the fear of missing out on the pleasures of sin, but also on the treasures of this life. Moses had total access to unlimited wealth, the thing that our society would say is more valuable than anything, right? If Moses was to go on Shark Tank, and he's got this new invention, right? The Miracle Staff 3000, it can do some awesome stuff, right? And the sharks, they're all in. They're biting on it. They want it. Cubans in at 1.5 million, 3% stake. It's a great deal, Moses. You should take it. But Moses walks away saying that what I'm after, you can't offer me. That there's something greater that I'm looking for. As Moses rejects that fear of missing out on wealth, he doesn't do so without weighing the cost. Right? Verse 25 and 26, they both use language that say that Moses chose or Moses considered. But as Moses considered the decision to miss out on the pleasures of sin and the treasures of life, he decided that the thing that was of most value to him was actually beyond the horizons of Egypt. That the reward that he was looking for could not be found here in this world. Philippians chapter 3, verses 7 to 9, they're some of my life verses, right? They're in my office on the wall, and in it, Paul writes, "Whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him." We overcome the fear of missing out by knowing what we value. And when we value Christ rightly, when we value Christ as he's worthy and deserving of being valued, when we have him as our one true reward in this life, all of those worries of what we might be missing out on, all of the worries of the pleasures and treasures that we might be saying no to, we realize that we're not missing out on much after all, right? So lastly, we read in verse 27, it says this, "By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible." Third and finally, Moses conquers the fear of his mistakes. And the key that he gives us is that we conquer our fear of mistakes by knowing who's in control. And in verse 27 here in Hebrews, we're kind of reading the highlight reel. If we're to look back at Exodus chapter 2, where it tells the fuller story in more detail, what we'd find is that Moses, one day when he's looking out upon his people, he sees an Egyptian that's beating a fellow Hebrew. And out of wrath and in a moment of anger, Moses lashes out and he kills that Egyptian. He buries him in the sand, but it's found out, right? And when Pharaoh finds out, He's filled with wrath and anger in response, and he seeks to kill Moses. But Moses, he leaves Egypt. So what is this story of Moses creating a huge mistake and there being massive consequences and yet him leaving Egypt? What does that have to do with fear? Well, it's in this, and this is a key, that it's in God's kindness that he uses Moses' irreversible mistake and substantial consequences to lead him to an ultimate decision. He used Moses' irreversible mistake and substantial consequences that he faced to lead Moses to make an ultimate decision. Anyone in here ever make a irreversible mistake with substantial consequences? Me too, right? We've been there. But what we read here is that it's through Moses' worst moment in life that God actually leads Moses to make a decision that's full of faith. Other versions retelling this same verse, they say things like, Moses left Egypt behind, or Moses forsook Egypt. The idea is that Moses, upon leaving Egypt, was making the ultimate decision to turn his back on everything that he'd known up to that point. Like, it's in this decision to leave Egypt that he pushes onward in faith out of Egypt to where God has called him. It's not that Moses is running from Pharaoh in this moment, but Moses is running to his purpose future that God had called him to. So my question is, where do you run when you make massive mistakes with substantial consequences? Do you run back to what's comfortable? Do you hide? Do you try to cope? Or do you allow your mistakes in life to push you deeper into surrender for the life that God's called you into? We all have that choice before us. And the way that we see Moses responded is that Moses allowed his mistakes to be used for God's good because he knew who was in control. There's a famous painter, right? Bob Ross. You've seen his afro, right? He's kind of a meme. But Bob Ross, I think he's got a good philosophy whenever it comes to painting. He had this phrase that said, "We don't make mistakes. We just have happy accidents." Right? He turned every imperfection in the painting into a happy little bird or a happy little tree. And what he's saying is that a good artist has the ability to turn mistakes into part of the beauty of the overall painting. I don't know about you, I can't paint worth a lick, but I know that I'm not a good painter, but I have a good Father, right? For those of us in Christ tonight, we have a good Father. And he doesn't just use your mistakes in life as little inconsequential birds or trees, but he actually has the ability to take your greatest mistakes in your life, your lowest moments, and use them as a cornerstone to turn your life around for the good. Like in 5 years, 10 years, to look back and say, I would have never expected it, but it was actually in that worst mistake that I made that God used it to call me into something better. That at my lowest moment, when I responded in surrender to say, God, bring me back, he used that to change and alter my life forevermore. And in Romans 8:28, it says that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. All things, even your mistakes. See, Moses, he knew that he served a king, that he had a God who had a plan in the midst of chaos. He knew that he served a king, that he had a God that could redeem his past mistakes. And Moses was right. Like, it was actually through this very mistake that Moses made, this sin, this low point in his life, that God led Moses out of Egypt. And it's through Moses' personal exodus out of Egypt that God prepared him to lead a national exodus out of Egypt with the people of Israel. God was doing something. He was preparing Moses in something through his mistake. Friends, believe tonight that God can work even in your lowest moments, even in your biggest mistakes. If you're here tonight and you're just standing in a pile of rubble because you have blown it big time, right? And you're walking around and all you see is pieces and fragments of the life which you once had. I just want to tell you that God can use those pieces. He can use that rubble and he can build something back. He can build something better. It requires you to have faith that he can, though. It requires you to respond to where he's calling you. So if tonight you're feeling that call, you don't know what your next step is, take a step towards God. He's calling you there. He can do something through it. And it's only through his sovereignty and his goodness, our conviction of that we can be fearless even in the midst of our biggest mistakes in life. Well, I started tonight with the idea that both faith and fear, they're defined by a reality that we express. But there's one more similarity as well. Not only are both faith and fear defined by a reality that we express, but they also have the power to determine the reality that we experience. I'll never forget one summer night. It was about 9 months into my marriage, just a normal weeknight in the summer, and my wife turned to me and she said, "Brandon, I think I'm having a heart attack." And I didn't know what to do in that moment. I was a fairly new husband, right? Didn't have much run time, and so I didn't know how to respond to this. It was in that moment that I was like, okay, let's rush, let's get in the car, let's pack the bag, let's get to the ER. And on the ride over was, feeling her pulse. It was racing, palms sweating, face pale. And after what felt like forever, waiting in the ER, the waiting room, the back room, waiting on results, after what felt like forever, the doctor came back and he said something that confused us both. He said, "Everything checks out. You're perfectly fine." That didn't really cut it for me. That didn't cut it for us because of the trauma that we had just experienced over the last several hours. And so pressed him for more information. And what he said was what he believed, that she had a panic attack. We didn't know what that was, and so processed a little bit more with him. And what he said was that when you're having a panic attack, your body convinces you that you're dying. Like it literally convinces the rest of your body that something is shutting down, that you are having a heart attack. And what he was saying in that moment was that panic, which is the personification of fear, right? It's fear in its deepest form. Panic has the ability to dictate the reality that you're experiencing. So my question tonight, as we close, is fear dictating the reality that you're experiencing? Like, does fear have you convinced that you don't belong, that you don't fit in, when the reality is that you've been purchased a place to belong, that you have an eternal home, a forever place with God? Does fear have you convinced that you're missing out on something big, something better, when the reality is that the most valuable thing you could have in your life is a relationship with Jesus Christ? There's nothing better. Does fear have you convinced that your mistakes and the consequences of your mistakes is just too high? So whatever plans God had for my life, they're done. I can't come back from this. When the reality is that your past and your mistakes, they're nothing in comparison with the cross. That they can't stand against what Jesus has done on your behalf. And that any mistake can be used as a cornerstone, as a stepping stone to the life in which God is calling you in, to come back to him? Does fear have you so convinced that it has a hold on you that you cringe at even the thought of trying to take a step in faith against one of these things tonight? That you feel chained to your seat, unable to respond to the reality that fear has had a hold on you, but it doesn't have to keep doing that. Like, you don't have to live in that place. Are you chained by it? The reality is that our reality, it determines our actions. When we drove to the hospital that night, or the ER, Val and I, we were driving in the reality that she was having a heart attack, right? So that dictated our actions. And yet, Moses, he lives under a reality of faith, and that changes everything about the way that he lived. Like Moses, in verse 27, it says that Moses, he endured as seeing him who was invisible. So Moses acted in accordance with his vision of God. He knew that at every decision point, at every turn in the road, at every fear which he faced, he had a God that was present. He had a God that was near, who could help him. And in doing so, he responded in faith. See, Moses, he endured as seeing an unseen God. Like, he had not seen Jesus, but yet we operate under the reality of a God revealed. His name is Jesus. Like Colossians, it would describe Jesus as the image of the invisible God. He is God that's become man. And it's through him that we have access into this place in which we will forever belong. It's through Jesus that we can obtain something more valuable than anything else in this life. And it's through Christ that we have grace that can cover any mistake in life. See, it's through Christ that if we would just see him, all of our fears would melt away. The reality is that for those of us in here who know Christ, he is with you. He is alongside you. He is for you. He can redeem. That's the reality. The only question is that the reality that you're living in tonight? Let me pray for us. God, we declare, God, we believe that you are the God of all, God, that you are the God over fear. God, that there is no fear in this life that is too big for you. And God, that in the midst of our worst decisions in life, God, in the midst of the times in which we live in complete fear, God, we're grateful because rather than scolding us, God, rather than being frustrated with us, God, you extend your hand, and God, you offer to draw us out. Just as Moses was drawn out of those waters, God, you draw us out of our fears. And you adopt us, God, not in a place that we don't belong, but God, to a family and a place which we belong forevermore. So God, I want to pray for my friends in the room who know Christ, my friends who have walked with you for a long time, God, and yet tonight, the reality that they're living in is one of fear. God, that the reality that they're experiencing is one in which they're missing out on so much that you have to offer them. Because they think that what might be here in this world is better. God, I pray that you would break those chains. God, I pray that you would replace the reality of fear with one of faith. God, that this room, this city would be changed forevermore. God, I want to pray for the one in this room that maybe they don't relate to those fears that we talked about tonight, but God, maybe they don't know you, and God, maybe they fear death. Like maybe they lay up at night wondering what's going to happen to them. God, and the doubts and the things that they don't know, it tears them up. And the reality is that there is a God out there who conquered death as well. Like as Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, moments before his arrest, his betrayal, his crucifixion, he was terrified. And yet he acted in faith for the moments that we haven't. He overcame the fear of what might come to him, the fear of the cup that the Father had for him. God, he went to the cross knowing the consequences. So God, if there are any in here that do not know you, I pray that they would tonight. I pray that they would know that God that conquered fears so that they don't have to. And God, I pray that the option of the realities that we have tonight, God, of faith and fear, God, I pray that you would draw us to the one in which is full of life, is full of joy. God, the one in which you would meet us there. Do that now. Do that amongst us. It's in your name that we pray.